Nor is he looked after by human hands as though he needed something, since he himself gives life and breath to everyone. So this may be, we might say, well, absolutely, that's right, Paul. We agree with Paul about the nature of God. But in many systems of thought about God, the gods were things that were served and had needs met by humans. Paul says a very Jewish thing. That's not how the real God works. The real God doesn't need anything from people. In fact, he is the source and supply of what you need. See the inversion there? And again, we have to think for a moment about people who didn't think of God necessarily from the story of what we would call the Old Testament, that sort of Jewish tradition. He's encountering people who thought about the gods in a very different way. What kind of God is this? It's a creator God. He made from one stock every race of humans to live on the whole face of the earth, allotting them their properly ordained times and boundaries for their dwellings. The aim was that they would search for God, perhaps even reach out and find him. Indeed, he is actually not far from each one of us. Paul later, maybe a decade after this moment, will write the letter to the Roman church and begin it basically with the same argument. God has been presenting himself to everyone who's ever lived through creation. We didn't always see him, but that veiled revelation was there for folks to find out. And now in Jesus, a very clear declaration, not only for Israel, but for all the world. Indeed, for in him we live and move and exist, as also some of your own poets have put it, for we are his offspring. Well, then, if we really are God's offspring, we ought not to suppose that divinity is like gold or silver or stone. We're not. We're not handcrafted by things like this, so God is not. Formed by human skill and ingenuity. You make all these statues, you build all these temples, God's made creation and you. That was just ignorance. But the time for it has passed, and God has drawn a veil over it. There's a big discussion this morning about ignorance. Generally, in our world, kind of culture, ignorance is seen in what way? Negative. If I say you're ignorant, which is East Texas for you don't know stuff, you ignorant. So you're ignorant, that's a very negative thing. I think it's maybe more of a neutral, even positive situation that Paul's trying to invite them into, which is to say, if you think in terms of education, or if you have at work, somebody that's new on the job, ignorance is fine if they know they are. Right? He's nodding. Yes, I've trained these people. It's the people who think they know that don't that are a real problem. Right? That's you've had this experience, all right? And forget the politics of it. It's a great line. Reagan in the 80s said his opponents, it's not that they are ignorant, it's what they know isn't so. That's just great line. Think whatever you want about Reagan, but the line's great. Paul here is saying, you didn't really know, and that's okay because knowledge has come to you now. Ignorance here isn't a judgment, it's a state of opportunity to learn. Does that mean a more positive way to say that? Is that fair? Saying I don't know is the beginning of learning lots of times if we have the right disposition. Not everybody's going to have that disposition, but Paul's looking for ones that are willing to say, you know what? Maybe I don't understand everything. What? That's exactly right. But I think in our culture, unfortunately, because we have, we can go into a number of reasons why this might be, but we have collapsed those two because we have made education into a wholly technical enterprise in which I have something downloaded into my brain, and they give me a test to prove that it's been downloaded there. That's computer language. That's functionally what takes place, right? So if that's the way education works, then not knowing is failure. Instead we talk about wisdom and growth, not knowing may be a big part of that process, and we might grow a lot by being able to say, I don't know, I'd like to learn. What do you know about this? And when we take it out of education and put it in work situations, some of the light comes on for them. Oh, that's not bad at all. What I want is a new employee to tell me, I want to learn this. Not the one that shows up and says, I got it all. I know what's going to happen. I got this figured out. Because we've all been down that road. Well, at least some of us have been down that road professionally. I think it works religiously too. If we're willing to say we don't know, then we got a chance to learn. So I think this ignorance is more in that way. And this is sort of, God did speak and reveal himself particularly to Israel, but Paul's sort of argument, which is Jewish, isn't that God had no concern for other nations, and in some sense was present to them in creation and in goodness and beauty and other things we might point to. but they were unable really to reach full conclusions about that God, so they're not to be blamed for having a statue to the unknown God. But now, knowledge has come to you. Right? This is the offer being made. But now, he commands the whole human race everywhere to repent, because he's established a day on which he intends to call the world to account with full and proper justice by a man whom he has appointed. He hasn't said Jesus' name yet, but you all read the book. God has given all people his pledge of this by raising this man from the dead. So up to this point, it's been sort of I want to speak to Greek people, but he's managed to do so in a very Jewish way. This is a Jewish story of God, the Creator God, who is going to put things right? Judgment of God all through the Old Testament is part of the story. And again, ignorance like judgment has become a very bad word, but in biblical terms, judgment is good news. It is the way in which God's going to put right that which has gone wrong, right? To make right that which is upside down. That's righteousness. Make right, put right, heal, fix, forgive. And to be a part of that, right, to join in that, we admit, the way we're going isn't good, and repent of that. It's a very Hebraic story, but he tells it in the most Greek way he can. I just think that's interesting to note in this context, that he finds a way to meet the people as best he can in the culture in which they are, without changing the fundamental story that he's telling. There may be some insight for us in that. Be sensitive to how we tell a story so that the people we're trying to reach can actually hear it without changing the content of the offer of the good news and the salvation therein. God has given all people his pledge by raising this man from the dead. So in this, as we talk about, we're on the other side of Easter, right? The resurrection is a part of this. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them ridiculed Paul. Resurrection was a silly notion. I often point out, we didn't just realize, because we have iPads, cellular telephones, and the internet, that people who die tend to stay that way. That is not a recent breakthrough. Ancient people knew that real well. In fact, on some level, they knew it better than we do. Because where did people die? At home, right? Hospice was hard to come by in the first century. They're lovely people. I highly recommend them when you are in need of help with end-of-life folks, either for yourself or for loved ones. But people died at home. And they watched this happen to the people. There's nowhere else to go. There's no hospital to go to. They knew death, and they knew its finality. All people knew this. The astounding claim was that death couldn't hold Jesus, and now death and our relationship to it had been defeated and altered in a very powerful way. But that's a challenge to Greek thinking that had sort of orderly systems of how the universe worked, and death was a part of that. We will give another hearing. But others said, we will give you another hearing about this. That is to say, that's an interesting idea. We'd like to hear more about that. So Paul went out from their presence, but some people joined him. And as they followed, they had further conversation, and they believed, including Dionysus, a member of the court of Areopagus, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. All right, so Wright, if you read Wright, he does this section twice because he wants to talk about some things we've already talked about in the nature of Athens, the nature of Greek philosophy, and then about Paul's response with the good news therein. And he wants to talk about resurrection in the other section. So he lists it twice. I'm not going to read it again. You're welcome to read it as many times as you want, 22 through 34. We're going to jump to 18. Questions, insights, comments on Athens and Paul there? We're about to move on to Corinth. All right. When we were in the choir loft, you guys couldn't stop talking. We get back in the sanctuary, and you're all worried I'm going to tell your mother you talked in church. I think I know. I can see the room affects us. After this, verse 1 of 18, page 94 if you're reading right. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila, who hailed from Pontus and had recently arrived from Italy with Priscilla, his wife, due to Claudius's edict banishing all Jews from Rome. This is a historical event. We can't say for sure why. If you read your right, it will tell you that what's the Roman historian? Suetonius, I think, isn't it something like that? Has a line that says in about, 49, what we would call 49 AD, those are later descriptors, right? If you get something that says Julius Caesar, that's probably a terrible cover band. Julius Caesar 44 BC on it, don't buy it. It's not real, right? It's not how that would work. But around that time frame, we can date this event. They're driven out because of riots among the Jews on account of Christus, which, if you know your Latin, you're like Christus and Christ aren't far off. And it's quite possible what we have here is a extra-biblical witness to these tensions that Paul's living in among Jewish communities, some of whom are proclaiming Christ and others who are deeply offended by this. Like many rulers in many places, an emperor found a chance to blame a minority group for some problems that were going on in the city and said, we'll kick all the Jews out of the city for a time. This happens. They do come back at some point. Nero becomes king. And I know you probably know Nero's the guy that plays the fiddle when Rome burns, but the early part of Nero's rule, people were excited, thought finally somebody good. It goes downhill. But the initial returns, he had, his, what do they always say with presidents? His approval rating was very high early on. It fell, but it was promising early. So Nero, they could come back, but we have a range there, and this, by the way, may account for why Paul writes the letter to the Roman church. So the Romans that you know in your Bible is written to Roman church that seems to have a real center around how do we live together as Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians. That's part of the story in Romans. Because imagine if the Jews get kicked out, Gentile believers don't have to leave. Right? Gentile believers can stay in Rome. And so for a real time in Rome, what we might have is a purely Gentile church. And then those Jewish believers come back when the Jews can come back, like Priscilla and Aquila, who are clearly key leaders in the early church, mentioned several times, mentioned by Paul back in Rome when he writes Romans, and mentioned here in Acts, that were important folks. And so it may be that we have some record of that. It could be that some Jewish guy named Christus kind of sounded like Christ, and he was causing problems. That's possible. This is the way ancient history works. We don't have video evidence of these moments, but it sure fits with what we know of the first century, what we know of Jewish-Christian dialogue, that it may be the cause of the problem in Claudius. Because for a Roman person in 50, this is an internal, we're going to hear this from a Roman ruler here in a second, this is an internal Jewish argument. Right? They don't recognize Christians as their own threat yet. Give it 50 years and they will. But at this point, they don't even understand, okay, you guys are arguing about this. I don't want to be involved in your inter-tribal conversation. So that may be kind of what's going on there. Okay. Paul paid them a visit, and because they were in the same business, he stayed with them and worked. They were by trade tent makers. I believe NT right here is correct in telling you that this doesn't mean that Paul has a part-time job at Academy. All right, so tent making here is not recreational at the Roman state parks. This is leather woodworking, tents of canvas and leather, military usage. If you move a bunch of troops, you got to house them somewhere. You can imagine in the ancient world, the Roman army wasn't a bad group to be selling stuff to if you're trying to make some money. But this was a craft that he had. Oftentimes, Paul would mention this in his own work, particularly when financially supporting Paul as a minister or his ministry caused offense. Paul would say, fine, I'll just work and sell stuff. It seems that they were in the same line of work. They are merchants. They would work together. Maybe take him on as a partner. Maybe he's a laborer among them. We don't know. Tent making is a broad category. In the same way, you may know, like Jesus, his profession, son of a carpenter, right? Well, the word is tekton, right? Tekton means craftsman. Is probably a better translation. And Jesus, if we hear carpenter, I don't know what you think of, but I think of you make tables for the people in Waco, right? Like you do cabinetry for fixer-uppers. That's what I do. I'm clearly that good with wood. I'm not. We think of carpenter in that way. Jesus and Joseph before him would have likely worked with numbers of materials, and the most abundant material in Israel is not wood. It's stone. That's exactly right. Someone's seen the pictures. Remember, Israel looks a little bit like going out I-10 and getting to Junction, right? Just a lot of rock, hills. There's a section, in Israel's diverse, as is Texas, but that's a space that looks a lot like that. There's a lot more rock than trees. There's some woodwork that would be done. I say this for two reasons. One, these are categories, tent making and craftsmen. And it's not that Jesus isn't a carpenter, it's just that his carpentry would have been done with stone more likely than with just wood. Also, I don't know if you know anybody that works manual labor with their hands. If you do, don't fight them, right? They are strong. And so I said to say, some of our images of Jesus, even in a physical way, sort of, I don't know what you have, but Jesus meek and mild was the image I was given in Sunday school, and it looked like he just got off the beach in Southern California sometimes, the long hair, pretty Anglo, blue-green eyes, whatever, and he just went surfing, but really kind of waify and skinny. Probably not. You got a stonemason, that man's hands were strong. And probably had a yoke around his shoulders to tell you he could pick some things up. This was probably sturdy build, probably a sturdy person. Not that matters what your image of Jesus is, but I do think it's helpful sometimes to challenge what we absorb as the way Jesus would look or be about. If he's working with stone and wood for that matter, if he shook your hand, you would know it. You know those people? You would know it. So I don't know if that's helpful to you. For me, it's a nice reset. So Paul's a tent maker. He had a skill and a trade, same idea. It wouldn't be just making tents, though canvas and leather would be the goods he worked in. Paul argued every Sabbath in the synagogue and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was putting great energy. I love this. Paul, remember they'd gone on a different kind of part of the mission, and now they're meeting back up. And really, sometimes they have to get Paul out of town because he becomes more of a detriment to the mission than a help. He becomes, pretty unpopular. Paul was putting great energy into the task of bearing forthright witness to the Jews that the Messiah really was Jesus. I love that. When they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his clothes out. It's like shaking the dust off of something. I'm not responsible for you. Your blood be on your own heads, he said. I am innocent. From now on, I shall go to the Gentiles. He means in Corinth. Right? We'll see him in the next town do the exact same pattern. For whatever you want to think about Paul's pattern here, he doesn't hold the rejection in a synagogue in one town against the next. When he shows up in the next town, he goes to the synagogue again and tries again. And if you read Romans again, his heart aches that all of Israel would be saved, right? That his own people, his own kind of ethnic descent of Abraham would get on board with this. Jesus as the fulfillment of Israel's hope. He moved on from the synagogue and went to the house of a man named, this is one of my favorite stories, by the way, in Acts, of Titius Justus, a God-fearer who lived opposite the synagogue. I don't know, the opposite of the synagogue is one of those lines that you can miss really easily. He set up shop right across the street. Here's the synagogue. Here's the new church. We're talking about Jesus across the street. And it reminded me of, I don't know if it's still true, but I was in some business class in college 20 years ago, and we were studying different marketing, different plans. And one of the interesting ones that struck me was that Wendy's, which is right here, for a long time, maybe they don't anymore, used to not do any demographic research. They did zero. They spent $0 on figuring out where to put their stores. They'd find out where McDonald's had bought property, and find a lot that would work for them as close as possible to the McDonald's. McDonald's spent a lot of money on figuring out where to put their franchises. And so in a sense, Paul's in the same thing. And I don't know if Wendy still does that. I thought it was kind of brilliant and cost effective, right? And then it's also, by the way, if you drive around enough, you'll see Wendy's in strange spots right next to a McDonald's. That maybe it must be legacies of that. The lot wasn't perfect, but it's in the right spot. As all was available. Here Paul says, okay, people are already coming down the street to go to worship and have a conversation in the synagogue. We'll set up our thing right across the street. And here comes folks into the house. And they got a good get here, verse 8. But Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord. With all his household, and many of the Corinthians heard about it, came to faith and were baptized. Obviously, he's respected. It says ruler. Think of president, elected leader, respected leader of the synagogue. Keeps the administration going, make sure all the supplies are there. You're Al Whaley. This is the head of trustees. This is what this is. Al's over here. He heads our trustees here, and he's fantastic at it. This man can make a 3-hour meeting fit into an hour, even if I'm there. He's unbelievable. So that's who Crispus is, and it's a good get. And his belief not only leads to his household, but to other people saying, wow, if Crispus is in, then maybe there's something to this. And maybe this is why Paul can, by the way, stay in Corinth for a little bit longer than other towns. There also may be something to the fact that Corinth is a little bigger city. I need to get better hill country references. But if something happens in Comfort, right? If you cause a disturbance in Comfort, by that afternoon, everybody knows what you've done. Die ball is what I want to say. If you do this in die ball, everybody knows by the end of the afternoon what has taken place. If you cause a disturbance in Houston or San Antonio, there's lots of things happening. Maybe the Spurs lost the playoff game. There's other things to talk about. There's not other things to talk about in these other towns. And so pretty quickly, Paul gets the officials on him. Here in Corinth, it seems that he can stay a little longer, and it may be because he makes some powerful converts. Maybe there's enough of the Jewish population that come over to this new fledgling thing. It may also be just it's a bigger town, so it takes longer to wear out his quite intense welcome. The Lord spoke to Paul by night in a vision. Don't be afraid, he said. Speak on and don't be silent, because I am with you, and nobody will be able to lay a finger on you to you or harm you. There are many of my people in this city. He stayed there for 1 year and 6 months, 18 months, which is a long time given the pace that we've been changing towns, teaching the word of God among them. A couple things. One, I don't know about you, Pastor Greg, but that little word from God there is something I can almost have above my door. When I walk from my office out to teach Bible study or preach or whatever, keep doing what I built you to do, right? That's because sometimes we can convince ourselves we need to stop doing it. Speak on and don't be silent. I'm with you. That's a good thing to have, right? We don't know the context of which Paul receives this vision. We know it's on the back end of already deciding the synagogue's not with him. But it sounds a little bit to me like the sort of echoes of the Elijah story. Remember the Elijah story when he's in the mountain? It's one of my favorite stories. I don't have a lot of favorite stories. But Elijah has this confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel's really cool. You've met the nuns there. They're not selling caramels. It's a real missed marketing moment. Wendy's would not have missed that. They really should be selling caramels. But it's the Carmelite nuns. That's what they're called. And they're up there. That's where the contest was between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. It's the one in which they dance around, try to wake up the Canaanite folks. They don't wake up. God pours fire down on Elijah's thing, burns it up. They take out the prophets of Baal. It's this great moment of victory. And then Elijah hears that the queen, right, doesn't like what he's done with her prophets of Baal and is threatening to take him out. And there in this moment of triumph, he goes mopey and heads to the hills, right? Elijah goes out there and he's sitting in the mountains and he says, I'm the only one. No one else will do anything, Lord. And I love what God comes and says, I got 8,000 people down the hill. And it's really easy sometimes. And here we don't need Paul moping here, but maybe Paul needs a shot in the arm here. Keep it up. Stay here. Don't move on. Because the traveling around can get to you. Some of you guys were military families. I know some of y'all get the itch. A year in, we got to move. No, you don't. That's what the Lord says to Paul. Stay put. Keep doing this thing. Maybe he's at insurance. Maybe he needs to hear, you're not alone in this. That's what Elijah needs. And then he needs to hear that Elisha's coming up behind him. Not only is he not alone, other leaders are being called up. God's got other people. And sometimes, maybe even after victories, we think that victories and great moments are finish lines. When God's just getting started, it's really easy to think that God's done because the prophets of Baal have been defeated. Well, they're just getting out of the way so we can do the thing I want you to do, Elijah. And Elijah's in the hills needing for God to call him out of his kind of cave. I don't know if that's where Paul is or if it just parallels in some way in my thinking about that, but that's what I take from this. Questions, comments? Yes, ma'am. Oh, I think that means there are many people that are doing the same work that you're about here. Others could maybe suggest that there are people that are going to come to faith, and God knows that, and so Paul needs to stay until that happens. But Paul's not the only way they come to faith, so I don't know if is that where you're headed with that? I don't know. Yeah. I take it to be, Paul, you're not alone in this work. I've got important things for Corinth. And I want you to stay here and dig deep into the work of my people in Corinth. That's where I would take it. I wouldn't take it to be a prescribed number of believers who are already set out. But I'm not a Calvinist, so that's probably a danger of my own sensitivities there. Calvinists are great. I think we'll all get there. It's just our understanding of how everybody's getting there may be slightly different. Now, I do think about one thing that you asked about last week that I think does relate to this process. You asked about discernment last week. We kind of talked about discernment and how different it is along the way with Paul here. And here's another moment in which sort of there's another word. It doesn't tell him how long he's going to stay. It just tells him to stay. And so I think one of my frustrations that God and I have talked about at times is that I would like a script for the rest of the play. I don't mind being in the production, but I'd sure like to know what my part's going to be in the third act. Except it doesn't seem to work that way. I get today. And part of that is, I confess, my desire, what's the word? Control, right? To control not only my own participation, but some of the outcomes perhaps. Here's the thing. The older I get, the more I realize that some of the stuff that I'm in control of didn't turn out as good as the stuff that God was in control of, and the trust in that develops. That doesn't mean I don't believe in agency, I just said I did, right? Pushing as Calvinist. But I do think one of my answers in reading Acts is, I can't tell you how it happens, I can say that it does happen. That God is faithful to those who are trying to discern whether they should stay or go, whether they should be open to a new thing or closed to an old thing. I think God is faithful to discernment. We talked last week about it not being a side hustle, meaning you can't one-off discernment. Like this is a becoming that we go on the journey. And I'm not like, look, if someone tells you the destination doesn't matter, it's all about the journey, don't go anywhere with them. Don't get in a car with someone that doesn't believe in destinations, right? I love that slogan, so I was like, oh, it's all about the journey. I'm like, is it? I mean, maybe it's a lot about the journey, but if it's only about the journey, I'm good. Like, I'd like to know where we're going. Which, by the way, I think is some of the reasons why our words, even politically, are broken. Like, I get asked all the time, because I think it's a curiosity, like, are you a conservative or a progressive? And I will always ask, well, tell me what you're talking about, and I'll tell you if I want to keep it. And tell me where you're going, and I'll tell you if I want to progress there. Like, those words have to have content for me to have meaning for them. I think it's the same thing with some of this, with what we do in our journey with Jesus. Each of that daily bread piece, that becoming along the way is part of it. It's going someplace. The destination matters deeply. But along the way, in this daily bread, daily figuring out, raising kids, working jobs, having relationships, having friendships, being in ministry and service, like what all those things are, there's part of that process that is the daily encounter with God and developing into the person I'm supposed to be, which leads to discernment, right? Romans 12, the transformation and renewal of your mind. Then you will know the will of God, right? What is good and pleasing. I don't know if that's helpful at all, or if I've muddied the water from last week, but I thought a lot about your question that was good. And I thought that's one of the reasons I love Acts. Part of me wants it not only to be a script for me, but I want to read Acts that gives me a process to say, okay, I do A, B, and C, and that produces D, discernment. The issue there is, then again, now I have a process that's independent from God's activity that I can control and produce an outcome. And it starts to look a little bit like a magic spell. Right? We wouldn't call it that, but that's kind of the way that thinking is. Like, I do the ingredients, I stir it up, and I get the outcome that I want to have happen. That doesn't seem to be how God works. Some of the Canaanite gods work that way, but not Israel's God, not the God of Jesus. I want him to sometimes. I'll just confess. We've wrestled about that, but every time we've wrestled, I've lost, and it's been good for me. I don't know how else to say that, but that's been the truth. I wanted to go to law school, and here we are. So, and most days I'm pleased with that. Y'all are great. This is great. We're having a great time. Great question. Any other questions on this? On 18? Yeah, man.
You are probably liked a lot more as a minister than you would be.
I'm liked more. We should hang out more. Yeah, you might be surprised. But yes, I'm kidding around. This is always the thing. I was like, that would be better. I should do that. Corinth, we've talked a lot about Corinth. We did Corinthians. Paul spends a lot of time there. Obviously, the church becomes an important part of ministry and mission there. It is a kind of a wilder city. It's a port town, which is still something that means something. It meant something in the ancient world. People are coming in and out. They have sort of an energy for things that may not be wholesome in Corinth. I often say that it's kind of Vegas-y, New Orleans-y. Like there's just a different kind of vibe there that comes through in the letter to Corinthians, and it's interesting that God wants him to put down some roots and hang out there. Wright had a great quote about discernment that I thought, was it in this section? I think it was. I know I marked it on my other book. Yeah, top of 99 if you're in it, but he must stay put, not move on. One of the many lessons Acts teaches quietly as it goes along is that you tend to get the guidance you need when you need it, not before, and not in too much detail. Enough to know that the Lord Jesus has many people in the city, and he wants you, Paul, to stay here and work with him. Yeah, I mean, that's in 2 sentences he said better than what I spent 5 minutes on. We could have probably saved some time. But that's what I'm getting at. Like, I think there's an element of development of trust in the journey as God says, for today, this is what I need. And then let's talk tomorrow about what's going to come next. And I just to try to be honest, I'd really like a 10-year plan sometimes. Yeah. All right. 12. When Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, let's go with Achaia. I loved when we crowdsourced this last time, by the way. It's my most fun I've ever had with Greek pronunciation. The Jews made a concerted attack on Paul and led him to an official tribunal. Wright mentions this, but if you didn't read your Wright or care to know, this is one of those interesting kind of like seemingly throwaway lines. And men in the school of ancient world will tell, like until there's like a stone with somebody's name etched in it, they presume in a religious text that it isn't historical, which I think is a crazy way to do scholarship, but some of the minimalist schools, especially in Scandinavia and Germany, German schools work this way. Well, they did find this guy's name in this area, and so we can date his rule in this way, in this moment, from like 49 to 51 AD. Again, that's our time marking, but we know when that took place and when this thing was found, and it sort of becomes a pen on which we can kind of date things around Paul's ministry because he's brought before this particular ruler in this particular town. This man, they said, is teaching the people to worship God in illegal ways. So here's where we get to the discussion that says, it seems that for the late Republican period of the Roman culture. Remember, Julius Caesar and then like Octavius and that whole, the Civil War and then the rise of the emperors, the change from a republic to an empire. It always sort of shocks some people when they realize it was a republic first and then became an empire with emperors, because we sort of have this modern notion of history that things are always getting better, which I think is kind of interesting. Because the 20th century didn't exactly do that. Well, we don't have to go over the world wars, but I mean, it didn't go well as things getting better. So this idea of progress. But so during the Republic period, and even during Jesus' life, it would seem that there was some protection for Judaism to be a distinct group within the empire. That is, Romans didn't really understand Jewish religious thought. They seemed to be like oddly stubborn about holding onto their traditions and not wanting to, like everybody else, incorporate the emperor or Roman sort of culture in their worship. The deal seems to be cut around. We won't pray to the emperor and his family or the ruler in Rome. We'll pray for them. And that holds for a while, but it was fragile. And it's, think in terms of like, it sounds funny to pray for Rome or it's for its leaders or pray to them. But in a sense, this is like a patriotic thing, right? This is for us would be like singing the Star Spangled Banner on 4th of July. And there's this one group saying, well, we won't sing that. We'll be like, well, what's going on with them, right? That's how the Romans viewed Judaism. And there was this kind of tenuous sort of, okay, we'll allow you to be sort of odd. That sort of fails, and that's part of the pressure around. That's what leads to the revolt that gets the temple destroyed in 70 AD, right? And by then, it's a full-on empire with emperors that more and more wanted to see loyalty shown by respect for the what they call the Roman cult, the cult of the Roman emperor and his family. So Christians were sort of under this umbrella. And so one of the things it seems early on synagogues were saying, hey, they're not us, and they shouldn't be protected in the same way that we're tolerated. Tolerated is probably a better word. They shouldn't be tolerated in the same way that we're tolerated. Does that make sense as to what kind of is going on in the community here? Paul was getting ready to make a defense here, ready to speak, when Gallio intervened. Look here, you Jews, he said to them. If this was a matter of serious wrongdoing or some wicked villainy, I would receive your plea in the proper way. But if this is a dispute about words, names, and laws within your own customs, you can sort it out among yourselves. I don't intend to be a judge in such matters. Then he dismissed the tribunal, but the crowd seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him right there in front of the tribunal. Galileo, however, totally ignored this. So we have echoes of another Roman ruler who sort of tried to wash his hands of a situation like this, right? Echoes of Pilate here. I don't want to settle inter-Jewish customs argument. If these people are burning down houses, if they're robbing people, if they're causing violence, if they're damaging the peace, then we'll talk. That's what he's saying. But this, he says, is a inter-community argument. And you can see why Luke, remember going back to Luke wrote this, remember who he writes it to, Theophilus, right, lover of God, but probably a Roman, Greek-cultured, important person who has become a believer and say, look, here's stories of Roman leaders recognizing that what's happening here isn't a threat to Roman authority. In the late first century, that'd be an important question about early Christian communities. So he washes his hands of this and says, this is not a matter for me to decide. It's for y'all to settle. It's an inter-community debate. And in the first century, that's true. By the second century, it is pretty clearly a dominantly Gentile faith. And of course, that's true 2,000 years later in the 21st century. Questions, comments on that section? What do you like? I do not know the ruler of the synagogue and whether he's a replacement or just in another synagogue than Crispus. And why they decided to take it out on him, maybe he didn't settle this, or maybe he's a believer, I don't know. In fine English form, he has a long discussion of getting lost on walking holidays. It's a big thing in England, not getting lost on walking holidays. But it's a discussion of how this sort of story helps us pin Paul's timeline. And it's a great story about how you can have a map and a compass, but if you don't know where you are, neither one of those things is really all that helpful. You kind of have to know, in some sense, where you are to be able to use a direction and a map to use that direction to get you someplace, right? You can kind of say, okay, I know I want to go north, but that's only true if you're south of your destination. Did that go too fast on that? It does at least orient you. That's right. It's better than not having them. And then you might be able to get to a place you can identify on a map. I had an experience in England that was similar to this. So they don't call their roads like, I-35 north, I-35 south. It would say, this is 35 Austin, right? Because the road goes to Austin. And so, this is a lifetime ago, Holly and I had thought it'd be a good idea to rent a car in England because I was doing a wedding for a dear friend that was in Durham, and we thought we'd make a trip of it. We did. We're driving. This is a decade ago. Holly's navigating, and she has the map, and I'm driving. So I'm just following instructions. I'm driving the wrong side of the road to begin with, which is fine going forward. Backing up is bizarre. I don't know if you've done that. It's a very strange experience. And so we want to go north, right? Because the Cotswolds await us, and like little J.R.R. Tolkien-looking villages. That's what we want to see on our way up north. And we're going on this road. It's like 68 to Poole. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Well, apparently, there's multiple pools in this country. And we were headed to Poole by the Sea, which is to the south. We get off to a petrol station. That's like gas, but way more expensive. That we were filling up, and I'm trying to get the guy to explain to me, and he, great English accent. And I was like, why don't you say north or south? And he says, well, because sometimes the road does this way and this way. It's not always. I go, okay, I'm leaving this country. So I haven't been back since. No, it was great. But that's sort of the notion here is that these moments allow us to orient where we are in Paul's story. But I think there's a deeper sort of conversation about that in our own journeys with this sermon. I think part of what we do sometimes is trying to discern things without a map, without a compass, and not knowing really where we are. And so we get these odd cultural messages that say, well, if you only follow your heart, you'll never get lost. Yeah, right. That was like 8 decades of wisdom to just laugh to my right over here. Yeah, you could get real lost following your emotions, if that's what you mean by following your heart. You can get real trapped by thinking if I only follow the rules, I'll be free. Great story about that, right? Les Mis, if you're familiar with the play. Right? If we make the rules work, that's one of the main characters of that story, we have to enforce the rules, and then the world will be just and make sense. Except it doesn't always work that way, right? Anyway, one of my favorite stories. Is a great book. All right, we're in Ephesus and Corinth. Are we ready? In 18? Paul stayed on for several more days with the Christians, and they said his farewells and sailed away to Syria, taking Priscilla and Aquila with them. They're clearly partners in this ministry all the way through. it's so hard for me not to do a soft C. Latin has no soft C in classical Latin. This is the nerdiest thing I've ever said to you. It's all hard C. So we say Caesar salad, it would be Kaisar, which if you hear that, you know why the Russian rulers are called what they're called. They're called czars, because that's how the Romans would have pronounced Caesar. We say Caesar, and they never would have said that. So this would have been Ken Charia, but we can say Sensor Korea if you want to. He had his hair cut off since he was under a vow, Nazirite vow, familiar with those. When they arrived at Ephesus, he left them there while he himself went into the synagogue and disputed with the Jews. Doesn't hold it against the next synagogue, what the last synagogue did. When they asked him to stay with them for a longer time, he refused and took his leave. I can't tell you why. I will come back to you again, he said, if it's God's will. He's got other things to do. I think he's headed to Jerusalem at this point. Then he left Ephesus, went to, again, Caesarea. Then he went up to Jerusalem, greeted the church, and went back to Antioch. So he's retracing some of this journey, and he's going back home. I don't know what the word home means to you, what content is in the word home. But especially in the ancient world, when you've been away for a long time, coming home means something. And so it seems to me where Paul has decided, I need to go back and reconnect with where I started. So he checks in with the folks in Jerusalem, wants to tell them how things are going in this mission to the Gentiles that they've endorsed. He's also been taking up an offering pretty clearly, at least in his letters, in all of these places where new people come to faith, particularly Gentile folks, to take care of their Jewish brothers and sisters in Jerusalem, followers of Jesus who are Jewish, who are poor and isolated in Jerusalem. He wants to drop that off. And Antioch is the launching church, right? That's going back home for the people who prayed him into this ministry and supported him. That means something. So that seems to me what's going on and why he leaves and doesn't stay in Ephesus, which he obviously spent some time in, does write a letter to. Now they arrived in Ephesus. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get him back home. When he spent time there, he went off again and traveled from one place to another throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, encouraging all the disciples. Now there arrived in Ephesus a Jew named Apollos, who came from Alexandria, right? North Africa, which if in the ancient world, when we speak of this Roman Empire, North Africa above the Sahara Desert would be a part of that, right? Carthage is a North African city that's a rival of Rome until it's finally defeated. Alexandria in Egypt and the culture there, that North African part of the Mediterranean Sea would be a part of that story. He was an eloquent man and powerful when it came to expounding scripture. He received instruction in the way of the Lord. He was an enthusiastic speaker and taught things about Jesus accurately, even though he only knew the baptism of John. He was an enthusiastic speaker and taught things about Jesus. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him to one side and expounded the way of God to him more accurately. I love this story. A couple things. One, we're following Paul. We're getting a Paul-centric story, and Paul's important. But here we get at least a suggestion of some good knowledge. There are other people about this work. Paul's not the only one. And I will tell you, I love University. University is a great place, but we are not the only Jesus people in San Antonio. There are tons of Jesus people in San Antonio. Baptist, Catholic, non-denominational, denominational that say they're non-denominational. All kinds of different people that love Jesus and are doing this work. And so it's easy sometimes to think the ministry that we're doing, the people that we are the exhaustive list of the folks that God's up to working among. Here, Paul. This guy Apollos comes along with a different gift set. Pretty clear that Paul's not the most powerful orator. He's really smart. He's incredibly dedicated. He's willing to suffer for the cause. He has a particular training and background both in Jewish thought and in Roman culture that he can bridge this thing in much the same way that Moses can do that in the Exodus story. Paul's unique and important, but he even himself says, I'm not the most powerful speaker. Right? Apollos seems to be really good at that. And he knows most things about Jesus, and I love that. And look, maybe y'all know me, I think doctrine's really important. I think getting our creeds right and our doctrines right is really, really healthy. But I also note in this story, Apollos doesn't have all of it right, and God can still use him. I think that's really encouraging. God can still use him. And then when someone who does have knowledge that can be helpful to him, they don't condemn his teaching or tell him he can't do that. What do? They pull him aside. This is mentoring. This is coaching. This is blessing. This is an older couple saying this, young, just out of seminary, preacher who may have some capacity but could learn some things and say, hey, just want to make sure you know this is this other thing about Jesus that's really helpful for how you're explaining this to people. Plus, Baptism, even better than you think. Here's another piece of that. I just love so much of this. Apollos comes up, is named by Paul. They're not enemies. They are friends. It comes up in the Corinthian letter, right? In that great story where Paul says, some of you say you're followers of Apollos. Some of you say you're followers of Peter. Some of you say you're followers of Paul. And he said, did I miss something? Was Jesus divided? Right? And that's when he says, we are stewards in the household of God. We're the wait staff. I love this. I mean, I don't know, Pastor Greg, how you feel? I just love this notion of what pastors are. Or anybody that brings wisdom to somebody else in the gospel. Don't mistake your favorite. You can have a favorite waiter, but don't mistake your favorite waiter for the one who made, cooked, prepared, and supplied the food. Right? This is not, we didn't write this story. Like, we are recipients of this as well. And you may like a particular waiter at a place you go because they make you feel comfortable and you like how they bring the food to you and present it. But that's all they do. And that's basically what Paul thinks of pastors, clergy, even, apostles in a sense here. They are the ones who bring the meal that God has provided, that Jesus is at the table of communion. I love that notion. I love this mention of Apollos. That's what I take from kind of this thing that I find really edifying. There are other people doing this work. We're getting to Paul's story because Paul's important, but there's other people about this work with different skills that are blessing people. Apollos goes on. He went across to Achaia. The Christians in Ephesus, by the way of encouragement, wrote letters to the church there to welcome them. They're saying, he's a good dude. He can be a blessing among your community. They didn't say good dude, but, I grew up in the 80s. Okay. On his arrival, his work made a considerable impact through God's grace on the believers, since he openly and powerfully refuted the Jews by demonstrating from the scriptures that Messiah really was Jesus. That gets us to 19. We'll do 19 and 20 next week. Looking forward to that. We were 1 minute away from 7:30. Question, comments, things you're wondering about, things you're confused by, things you're thinking. What do you think, Pastor Greg? Yeah, good. He's down with our Apollos conversation. Yeah, it's good to know that we're not alone in the work, isn't it? I think that's important. And I love the notion of this couple, bringing him aside and saying, we want to help you be even better. You're really good. We're not against you. We want to help you succeed. It's a very different way to help somebody grow, isn't it, than you're doing it wrong. Which, as clergy, we could get coaching like that, right? Yeah, Pastor Greg. You're doing it wrong, which we are sometimes. That's totally fine. It's just nice when somebody says, let me see if I can tell you how I've experienced this in a powerful way. People have opened my eyes to things that the Holy Spirit can do, that Jesus can do. And I think all of us can be blessed by those sharings, especially when it's offered as I want this good thing for you. That's a very different thing than you're super wrong and I want to fix you, which is the general way the world works. Not just clergy, that's just the way the world works, right? And so I just put that out there to say, I think that's part of this story for me with Apollos. And I like that they're different gifts. Paul's a writer. Paul's a thinker. Not that he can't preach, but it clearly his, which would have been valued in the ancient world, his eloquence and physical presentation wasn't to the same measure as Apollos. And that's okay. God can use all kinds of different skills, all kinds of different people. Yeah. And don't confuse the waiter with the meal and the cook and the supplier of that sustenance. All right. Let's pray. God, thank you for a chance to read together. May the words grow. May your word grow in us. May you continue to feed us. May we be aware of, maybe as we drive home, let's just see all the churches that we see on our way home in a different light. That there is no competition among those who know your grace. There is only fellow workers in the same fields that we might proclaim in winsome and loving ways to a world that you love, of what you've done in Jesus for them and for all and for us. This in his name we pray. Amen.
Can I ask you about something about
Sure.